Hello everyone, Miss Carrie here from Miss Carrie's Creations. I was invited to be a guest designer throughout the summer on the Coffee Loving Cardmaker blog, and it's been so much fun sharing projects with you. Today I'm playing along with the best of 30 days of sketches with Christy's Beautiful Life, and I'm going to show you how I took a scrapbook sketch and turned it into a pleated coffee card. So I'm starting off with this fun little sketch created by Scrapbook Challenges, and I'm loving this block design. It reminded me of the quilts my grandmother used to make, and I decided that it would be perfect for a card. I'm going to be using some leftover papers from my SCT kit, and I'm going to gather a few of my paper scraps. This is a great card to help you use up some of those bits of paper you've been collecting. I also want to use a sentiment from this stamp set and the border stamp that has these cute little coffee beans so that I can replicate the border that's shown on the sketch. Now I'm going to create a larger 5x7 card today, and I'm going to rotate this sketch to make a horizontal design. I'm going to show you how I'm going to figure this out with a little bit of math so that I can scale down the 12x12 layout to fit the card. I'm just going to draw this out on my glassboard with a whiteboard marker. I'm going to take the width of the card, which is 7, and divide it by 3. This is going to give me the width for each of the squares, which ends up being one of those 0.33333 numbers that's going to be way too hard to work with. But it is pretty close to 2 1/4 inches wide. Now, if I make each square 2 1/4 by 2 1/4, I will only have a 1/2 inch at the base of the card to create my pleat. So I'm going to need to make my squares smaller, and instead of making 3 squares across, I'm going to create 4 smaller ones. Now, if I divide 7 by 4, I get 1 3/4 inches. So if I create the 1 3/4 inch squares, then I'm going to have 1 1/2 inches at the base of the card to create my pleat. Okay, so now that I've drawn this out and I figured out a direction to go, I'm going to cut all the squares out and show you how to make that pleat border for the card. I'm going to create the little pleat that's going to go across the bottom in place of that title. I have cut 2 strips of paper. One is sized at 1 1/2 inches wide by 12 inches long, and the other one is only 6 inches long. Make sure that the print on your paper strip is going the right direction when you cut and score this. I'm going to score this 1 1/2 inch strip. The first score line is going to be at 1 inch, the next score line at 1 1/4 inches. The next score line is at 2 inches. Then I'm going to score at 2 1/4 inch. The next score line is 3 inches. The next score line is 3 1/4 and 4, then 4 1/4, then 5, 5 1/4, and you keep going until you get to the end. So I'm going to go ahead and score both of these strips of paper, and then I'm going to show you how to fold them. So once your pattern strips are scored, we're going to fold on the score lines by folding the first score back and the second forward. Then the third score line should be folded forward and the fourth should be folded back. And you're going to start to see that box pleat pattern appear. So every other 1 inch piece is going to go underneath, and every other 1 inch piece is going to be your actual pleated piece. Once I have completed this pattern across that 12 inch strip, my border ends up being about 6 1/2 inches long, which would be great if I was making a standard A2 size card, but it's not long enough for a 5x7 card. So I'm going to bring in that second strip, and I'm going to adhere it in place underneath that last pleat. Where the paper strips attach is going to be hidden by a pleat, so you won't even know that I glued 2 strips of paper together. I'm going to finish folding this pleated pattern And then I'm going to show you how to glue all of the pieces together. So now that all the folds are in place, I need to adhere these pleats together. I'm going to add a little dab of glue under the pleat, and then I'm going to use these fabric clips to hold it in place. Using the fabric clips is a lot faster than trying to hold the pleat by hand, waiting for that glue to dry. Now, when I use fabric clips with paper, I always put the flat side against the paper that's going to be showing. The other side of the fabric clip has tiny little teeth, and I have discovered that they will leave marks on some of your patterns, whereas the flat side doesn't leave any marks. So I'm going to go ahead and finish adhering down all of these pleats, and then I'm going to set this aside to dry. So I brought over a piece of cardstock that's been cut to 5 by 7 inches. I will be adding some stitching to these squares, so it's going to be much easier to do this with a smaller panel than putting this all on a larger card base. It's also going to hide the stitching on the back side instead of the stitching showing on the inside of the card. Right now, I'm just adhering the squares in place over the grid lines I drew. I chose some fun patterns like rainbows and hearts and some solids for this card. Bright summer patterns are not something I often use, but I am liking all of the colors in this paper pack. I'm going to go ahead and go off camera and add stitching to the panel, and then I'll start stamping some of the images I need for the card. On the sketch, there's a little scalloped border. So I've cut one using a die, and I'm going to add some coffee bean images to it using a stamp. I'm going to do what's called tone-on-tone stamping, where I use the same color of ink as the cardstock. This is going to keep the images subtle and soft. I'm also going to heat emboss the Thanks a Latte sentiment for this card. I'm going to prep the cardstock with some anti-static powder, and then I'll stamp the image with some Versamark ink, sprinkle it with white embossing powder, and I'll heat set the image. All right, so I'm going to gather all the elements for this card so we can start putting it together. I have added some stitching to the blocks, and I've gathered a few other items that I need for the card, including a scallop circle tag that I cut from gray patterned paper. Gluing down the pleated border can get a little tricky, but if you add adhesive to the back side of each pleat, it makes it a little bit easier. I like to cut my pleated borders a little longer than needed so that I can center the pleats over the card. On top of the pleated border goes the scallop border I created. I'm going to adhere this down with some thin foam tape because that pleated border is a little bit thick and I need it to lay flat on the card. I'm going to trim off the excess with a craft knife, and then I'll finish adding some other elements. To finish off the edge on that scallop border, I am going to wrap some twine around the card. This is a pink and white twine that I'm going to adhere in place with some clear tape. So now that I have all these bright components on the card, I'm starting to struggle a little bit because vivid colors are not really in my comfort zone. So I'm going to try to tone these colors down a little bit with this gray circle tag. Over the top of this, I'm going to layer a little coffee cup and a sentiment. And then I'm going to add a cute little pink polka dot ribbon at the top of the circular tag. I'm also going to be tucking a little acrylic heart next to the coffee cup just to fill in that little bit of space. This is all going to be placed down on a 5x7 black cardstock card base. I did trim the edges of the blocks a little bit so that that black edge shows through the top. I will admit that this card is feeling a bit unfinished and it's so much brighter than I expected, but it really does remind me of the quilts my grandmother used to make. When you're a creator, you do find inspiration everywhere, whether that be in an old blanket or a sketch that was designed for a 12x12 page. On the sketch, there were the blocks, the scallop border, and the bold title. I was inspired by the block design to create the look of a quilt to mimic something my grandmother had made. I added some simple coffee images like the stamped beans on the scallop border and the little yellow coffee cup. And then I finished it off with the sweet sentiment, some bits of ribbon and twine. The design for today's Coffee Loving Cardmaker blog is bright, bold, and full of patterns, just like the scrap quilts my grandmother made. I rarely use bright colors, so this card was a bit of a challenge, but it is a really cute design. I want to thank you for joining me today for another project. Make sure you stop by the Coffee Loving Cardmakers blog today and check out some more coffee crafts you can make. If you would like to see more of those Best of 30 Days sketches ideas for today, I have put a link to the playlist in the description below. I hope that you have a wonderful week, and I can't wait to see what you create.